In 1885, when the wind over Deadwood Creek sounded like it was dragging chains across the plains, Thomas Hartwell stood alone in his gunsmith shop, filing down the barrel of a Colt as if he could smooth out the rough edges of his own soul. The room was dim, lit by a single oil lamp that threw long shadows over racks of rifles and revolvers, each one polished to a cold, unforgiving shine. Outside, the town noise was a low murmur. Wagon wheels, distant laughter, a piano trying to stay in tune, but in here, it was just steel, oil, and the sound of his own breathing. For 15 years, Thomas Hartwell was the most trusted gunsmith in 3 counties, the man lawmen and ranchers swore by, and outlaws respected enough not to cross. He was the most trusted gunsmith in 3 counties, but he had a secret that could destroy everything. That contradiction lived behind his eyes, in the way he sometimes paused just a little too long before answering questions, in the way his hand hovered a moment before locking the backroom door each night. His file stopped mid-stroke as heavy footsteps crunched on the wooden boards outside, slow, deliberate, not the casual stride of a customer looking for repairs, but the measured walk of someone who had already made up their mind about something. Thomas felt his jaw tighten, his heartbeat a fraction faster, as if his body recognized something his mind was still trying to deny. He set the gun down carefully, wiped his hands on a rag, and turned toward the door just as the bell above it jingled in a tone that suddenly sounded a lot like a warning. Deadwood Creek wasn't much to look at from a distance, just a crooked line of buildings huddled against the wind, a church steeple that leaned a little too far, and a main street that turned to mud every time the clouds got angry. But inside those weather-beaten walls were people who believed in Thomas Hartwell the way folks believed in Sunday sermons. When Wild Bill Hickok passed through and needed a new Colt, the story went, he came to Thomas. When a Pinkerton agent followed the trail of a train robber to the edge of town, it was Thomas's careful repairs and custom work that gave them the edge. His reputation was hammered into the town's bones. If a gun came from Thomas, it worked. But reputations can be lies that everybody agrees to believe. At night, when the lamps were turned low and the streets emptied, a different Deadwood Creek crawled out of the shadows. One where men with covered faces rode in without names, where coin bags were thrown on counters without questions, and where deals were struck in whispers at the back of Thomas's shop. And that secret was about to walk through his door. He felt it like a storm on his skin as the footsteps outside stopped, and for a moment he thought about the first time he'd said yes to the wrong man, the way fear made cowards of good intentions. But the door stayed closed for now, as if the town itself were holding its breath, and somewhere deep down, Thomas wished, just for a heartbeat, that no one would come at all. Before we go deeper into this, if stories like this grab you by the throat, consider subscribing. We've got more scars to show you. The stagecoach rolled into Deadwood Creek just before sundown, wheels groaning, horses coated in dust thick enough to hide their color. Folks barely looked up. Travelers came and went all the time, but one figure stepping down from the coach drew a few extra glances. A young woman, about 17, boots scuffed from long roads, a faded dress that had seen better days, and eyes that didn't belong to someone that young. Her name was Sarah Hartwell, though no one in town knew it yet. She paused on the last step, looking up and down the street as if trying to reconcile the place she remembered with the one in front of her. In her hand, she carried a small, worn photograph of a woman with tired eyes and a gentle smile. The edges of the picture cracked where Sarah's thumb had pressed the same spot again and again over the years. She hadn't seen him in 8 years, but today she came for answers. As she walked down the dusty street, people watched her with that quiet curiosity small towns are famous for, whispering under their breath, not about her, not yet, but about the man whose jaw would clench when he saw her shadow in his doorway. Sarah's steps were steady, but inside her chest, her heart drummed hard enough to make her feel a little sick. This wasn't a visit. It wasn't a reunion. This was a hunt for the truth her childhood had never been allowed to hold, Sarah hadn't grown up with clear memories of her father. What she had was sharper, more persistent whispers. In the small house where she'd been sent to live with relatives after her mother died, adults thought she was asleep when they talked, but kids learn to breathe quietly when the truth is hiding in the next room. She remembered the cracked voice of Mrs. Patterson saying, "That poor woman didn't die of fever. She died of a broken heart because of what he did." And another voice asking, "You mean Hartwell? The gunsmith?" And the silence that followed said more than words ever could. Those echoes were the reason she was here now, the reason that photograph in her hand felt heavier than iron. As she stopped outside the gunsmith's shop, she stared at the sign, Thomas Hartwell, gunsmith, and felt a strange mix of anger and longing twist inside her. People said her mother didn't die of fever. They said her mother died because of him. For years, she'd tried to convince herself it was just gossip, that grief made people cruel, that rumors liked to stick to broken families. But the older she got, the less those excuses comforted her. Sarah took a deep breath, pushed open the door, and stepped into the room where all her questions had been born, long before she even knew how to ask them. The bell above the door jingled, and Thomas glanced up with his usual weary politeness, the greeting he'd given 1,000 customers before. But the moment his eyes landed on Sarah, something in his face broke. For a second, he didn't see the grown young woman in the doorway. He saw a little girl clutching the hem of her mother's dress, hair in loose braids, staring up at the world with the sort of trust that now felt like a debt he'd never paid. His hands went still around the half-assembled Colt on the table, and the rag slipped from his fingers. "Sarah?" he breathed, more like a prayer than a name. She stood there, shoulders squared. "Hello, Pa," she said, and the word sounded foreign in her own mouth. He took a step toward her, then stopped, suddenly unsure if he had the right. 8 years was a long time to pack with silence. There were 100 things he wanted to say. "I'm sorry, I missed you. I thought you'd be safer away from me." But none of them made it to his lips. Instead, it was the unspoken question that hung between them, the one she'd carried all this way. "Pa, what did you do?" She didn't ask it out loud. Not yet. But he felt it anyway, like a weight that dragged his gaze to the floor. If this kind of tension hits you in the gut, go ahead and subscribe. These are just the first cracks in the story. That night, Thomas insisted on making dinner at the small house he lived in behind the shop. A simple meal of stew and bread, the kind of food you serve when you don't know how to say what really matters. The cabin was quiet except for the clink of spoons against bowls. Sarah ate mechanically, watching him over the rim of her plate, studying the lines in his face, the way his shoulders sagged a little when he thought she wasn't looking. He asked about her life with the relatives. Was she treated well? Did she go to school? Did she have friends? And she answered in short, restrained phrases, as if every word she offered had to be earned. Finally, she couldn't hold it back anymore. "Pa," she said softly, setting her spoon down, "I need to know the truth about Mama's death." The air in the room seemed to thin instantly. Thomas's hand trembled around the handle of his mug. "Sarah, your mother died of fever," he said, sticking to the story he'd told himself 1,000 times. "You know this." She studied him, eyes sharp. "People said her mother didn't die of fever. They said her mother died because of him." "That's not what Mrs. Patterson said," she replied. "She said Mama died of a broken heart, because of what you did." The silence that followed was worse than shouting. Thomas's knuckles turned white around the mug. "You ought not to listen to gossip," he murmured, but his eyes didn't match his words. Inside, Sarah felt a cold, steady anger harden. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a secret. Sleep didn't come easily that night for either of them. Thomas lay awake on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the window, haunted by 2 sets of eyes. His wife's, full of disappointment, and his daughter's, full of questions. In the small spare room, Sarah turned restlessly under a thin blanket, her mind replaying every word, every pause, every tremor in his voice. Just before dawn, she slipped out of bed, careful not to make the floorboards creak, and padded into the shop. The front room was familiar enough. Counters, shelves, tools, guns in various stages of repair, but it was the door in the back that drew her. The one with the sturdy lock and the worn handle, the one she'd never been allowed near as a child. She hesitated, listening. No sound from the bedroom. Her hand closed around the handle. To her surprise, it turned. He hadn't locked it. Inside, the air smelled different. Not just of oil and metal, but of ink and old paper. The walls were lined with shelves holding ledgers, boxes, and neatly stacked envelopes. She flipped open one of the ledgers, tracing the rows of entries. Dates, names, models, quantities. At first it looked like normal business, but then a few names made her pause. Dalton, Younger, Rustlers. Names she'd heard in newsprint and overheard in hushed conversation. As realization crawled over her skin, a chilling hook surfaced like a verdict. He wasn't just supplying the law, he was supplying the killers too. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't some wild accusation from bitter neighbors. This was his handwriting, his ink, his deals. Sarah pulled another ledger off the shelf, then another, her fingers moving faster as dread pushed her forward. One entry stopped her cold. A batch of revolvers and ammunition shipped out just weeks before the infamous Abilene Bank robbery. The date lined up. The quantity matched the description she'd heard in retellings. Her mouth went dry as she whispered to herself, "No." But the evidence stared back. Those guns killed 7 people, and he knew it. She remembered reading about it in a crumpled newspaper years ago. 7 dead, including a little boy who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The print was smudged, but that number had burned itself into her memory. She sank onto a wooden stool, ledger open in her lap, and for a moment she couldn't decide whether to cry, scream, or march straight into his room and shake the truth out of him. Instead, she forced herself to breathe, to think. Maybe there was more. Maybe there was a reason. Maybe. She flipped to the back, where tucked between pages was a folded letter, the paper creased and stained from being handled too many times. It was from someone named Dalton, written in ugly, hurried script, and the message was clear. "Supply us, or your family dies. If you're still here, you're in deep with this story. Hit subscribe so you don't miss how this plays out." When Thomas found her in the back room, the ledger was already open on the table, the Dalton letter beside it. His face went ashen, and for a moment he stood in the doorway like a man looking at his own grave. "You weren't supposed to see that," he whispered. Sarah didn't flinch. "I think I was supposed to see it a long time ago," she shot back. "How long have you been doing this?" He stepped inside slowly, as if approaching a wild animal. 3 years, he admitted. "They came to me one night. Men with guns, faces covered. They knew your name, your mother's. They said if I didn't supply them, they'd kill you both." His voice shook, the memory clearly carved deep. I thought if I agreed, I could protect you, control what they got, how fast, maybe delay things, sabotage if I had to." His eyes glistened with a guilt that had never really let him sleep. "They made me choose, between your mother and every innocent person in this town. They made me choose, between your mother and every innocent person in this town." He repeated it like a man reciting his own sentence. Sarah stared at him, torn in half. She could see the fear, the desperation of a husband and father cornered by monsters, but she also saw the faces of 7 dead strangers in Abilene, and who knew how many more. "That's not a choice," Sarah said quietly, but there was steel in her voice. "That's an excuse." Thomas flinched as if she'd slapped him. "You think I don't know what I've done?" he snapped, then immediately deflated. "Every night I see their faces. The men who used my guns. The people who died because of them. Your mother." His voice broke on the last word. "If I hadn't given in, they would have killed you both," he insisted weakly. Sarah shook her head, tears gathering but refusing to fall. Or maybe they would have gone to another gunsmith, she said. Maybe they still would have done terrible things. I don't know. But I know this. You didn't just protect us. You helped them. You kept going. You kept selling. Her breath hitched, and she delivered the line that cut straight through both of them. You didn't protect us, Pa. You protected them. He staggered back like her words were bullets. Silence hung between them, thick enough to choke on. What kind of father chooses the criminals? She whispered. What kind of father chooses the criminals? It wasn't a question she expected him to answer. It was the shape of the wound he'd carved into her life. Even as they argued, the past was already catching up. Sheriff Morrison had been tracking a pattern in gun serial numbers and bank robberies, and all his strings led back to one place, Hartwell's shop. That evening, as storm clouds crawled over the town, the sheriff walked up to the shop with a worn badge on his chest and suspicion in his eyes. Inside, Thomas straightened the counters with forced calm, while Sarah watched him from the shadows of the back room, her heart pounding. The bell rang, and the sheriff stepped in, scanning the walls, the guns, and the man who'd been supplying the entire region for over a decade. Thomas, he said calmly, I need to ask you about some gun sales. Thomas swallowed hard. Sheriff Morrison, you know I've always been cooperative, he replied, but his voice had a crack in it. That's what worries me, Morrison replied, because the guns used in those robberies, they came from your shop. Thomas's hand drifted unconsciously toward a hidden drawer beneath the counter, where an old revolver lay waiting. The room tensed. Then Sarah stepped out, breaking the line of sight like a sudden gust of wind. Wait, she said, the word sharp enough to freeze both men. She held a folded paper in her hand, the old theft report Thomas had filed when several guns had gone missing. Her voice didn't shake. Sheriff Morrison, those guns weren't sold by my father, she said, eyes locked on his. These guns weren't sold. They were stolen. She placed the paper on the counter. The sheriff stared at it, then at Thomas, whose eyes were a swirl of confusion and shame. The room, for a moment, belonged entirely to Sarah's choice. When the sheriff finally left, the shop felt emptier than it ever had, echoing with unasked questions. Thomas closed the door slowly and turned to Sarah. Why did you do that? He asked, his voice rough. Why did you lie for me? Sarah. Why did you lie for me? The question wasn't accusatory. It was bewildered, almost childlike. Sarah sat on a stool, her shoulders sagging under the weight of every decision she'd made that day. Because if they take you away without you making this right, then none of this means anything, she said. Because you're my father, whether I like it or not, and because Mama loved you, even when you didn't deserve it. She stared at him, tears finally spilling over. But Pa, this stops now. You can't keep doing this. If you stop, they might kill us. If you continue, they'll kill innocent people, and I can't live with that either. In that one breath, she laid out the impossible balance she'd been trying to hold since she stepped off the stagecoach. If you stop, they'll kill us both. If you continue, they'll kill innocent people. The room felt like a crossroads, every path lined with ghosts. If you're still with us, you're the kind of person who sees stories through to the scars. Hit subscribe so you don't miss how this ends. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He sat alone in the back room, surrounded by ledgers that suddenly looked less like records and more like gravestones. He ran his fingers over the inked names. Men who'd come in with desperate eyes, cold eyes, greedy eyes, and realized that whatever reasons he'd clung to, whatever justifications he'd whispered to himself in the dark, none of them changed what was on these pages. These were the receipts of his cowardice. He saw again the Dalton letter, the threats against his family, but this time he also saw something else. Sarah standing between him and the sheriff, lying to protect him, even after learning what he'd done. It was more mercy than he deserved. Slowly, deliberately, he gathered the ledgers into a pile on the workbench. His hands didn't shake this time. He lit a match, watched the flame curl upward, small and fragile at first, then hungrier as it lowered to the paper. He burned every ledger, every lie, every sin. The fire spread, devouring ink, dates, and names, turning years of secrets into curling ash. The room filled with smoke and heat, and Thomas didn't step back. He let the flames sear the edges of his guilt. When the last ledger fell into blackened fragments, he turned and walked out into the cold night air, heading straight toward the sheriff's office with the slow, heavy determination of a man walking to the gallows he'd built for himself. The confession didn't take long. There wasn't much to argue about when a man walked in and laid his entire soul on the table. Thomas admitted to the deals, the threats, the fear, the bank robbers, the gangs. He didn't try to paint himself as a victim, not anymore. The court session that followed was crowded. Word traveled fast in small towns, and Sarah sat in the back, her hands clenched in her lap, watching the man at the center of the storm. When the judge read the sentence, 5 years in prison for accessory to armed robbery and unlawful arms dealing, a murmur ran through the room. Some thought it was too light, others too harsh. Thomas just nodded once, accepting it. Later, during one of Sarah's first visits to the prison, they sat across from each other at a worn wooden table, barred windows casting lines of light between them. "Pa," she asked quietly, "do you regret it?" He looked older already, the weight of truth etching deeper into his features. He thought for a long moment, then said, "I regret the years I lost. But Sarah, I finally sleep through the night." It wasn't absolution. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened. But it was something, a fragile beginning kind of peace, and for the first time since she was a child, Sarah believed him. 5 years later, the sign hanging over the gunsmith shop didn't read Thomas Hartwell anymore. It read Sarah Hartwell, gunsmith. The town had been skeptical at first. A woman running a gun shop wasn't exactly common in 3 territories, but Sarah's work silenced doubt faster than any argument. Her guns were reliable, her repairs precise, and her manner firm but fair. Lawmen respected her. Ranchers trusted her. Outlaws knew better than to come near. She had taken the thing that had nearly destroyed her family and turned it into something clean. Sarah Hartwell became the first female gunsmith in 3 territories. She kept the front room much the same as her father had, but the back room, that was different. No secret ledgers, no hidden deals, just parts, tools, and a single framed photograph of her mother, watching over the place like a quiet guardian. When Thomas was released, older and thinner but with clearer eyes, he hesitated before crossing the threshold. Sarah met him in the doorway. There was a pause, a brief, uncertain moment where the past threatened to speak first. Then she stepped aside. "Come on," she said. "There's work to do." He smiled, small and fragile, and walked in to stand beside her at the bench, hands learning to build only for those who deserved it. In the years that followed, people in Deadwood Creek got used to seeing the pair of them working side by side. The aging man with the haunted eyes and the young woman with the spine of steel. They didn't talk much about the past. They didn't need to. It lived in the pauses, in the small kindness he showed to strangers, in the way Sarah made sure every gun leaving that shop went to hands that had earned her trust. Sometimes, at closing time, Thomas would sit on the front step, watching the sun dip below the horizon, and think about all the ways his story could have ended differently. Hanging from a rope in some forgotten town, murdered by the very men he'd supplied, or drinking himself to death under the weight of his choices. Instead, he'd been given something he'd never expected, a chance to make things right, even if only in small ways. She didn't just uncover his secret. She saved his soul. It was the quiet truth that threaded through every day they shared from then on. Sarah hadn't come back just to expose him. She'd come back to force him to look at himself, to choose, finally, who he wanted to be. And in doing so, She'd saved him from the worst version of himself, the one who never stopped, never confessed, never changed. If stories of redemption, scars, and second chances speak to you, subscribe. There are more tales like this waiting in the dust. Thomas Hartwell never escaped the consequences of what he'd done, and he never tried to. He carried the memory of those lost lives with him until the day he died, using that weight not as an excuse, but as a compass. He taught Sarah everything he knew about gunsmithing: how to feel when metal was right or wrong, how to listen to the sound of a mechanism clicking into place, how to respect the power of a weapon meant to protect, not terrorize. But more importantly, he taught her about integrity, in the hardest way a person can, by showing her his failure and his effort to do better. The town slowly rewrote the story it told about the Hartwells. Not a tale of a corrupt gunsmith who armed killers, but of a family who walked through hell and came back carrying truth. The gunsmith's secret daughter didn't just uncover her father's dark secret, she gave him the chance to redeem himself. And sometimes that's what family really is. Not blood that never fails, but people who force you to face who you are and stand beside you while you try to become someone worth forgiving. Real stories, real scars. Until next time.